For over 3 centuries, tens of thousands of people met their deaths accused of witchcraft, not because magic was real, but because fear was. Across cobblestone streets bathed in the dying light of October, shadows stretch like grasping fingers, and it is here that we encounter one of humanity's most haunting figures, the witch. Her silhouette against the harvest moon has terrified generations, yet behind the pointed hat and simmering cauldron lies a reality far more disturbing than any tale could convey. In the shadowed corridors of history, flames and ropes were tools of terror, wielded against those who possessed knowledge that threatened established power. Neighbor turned against neighbor. Accusations spread like wildfire, and centuries of wisdom were obliterated in moments of panic. Communities destroyed their own healers, not for their craft, but for what their skill represented, a challenge to authority. The stories we tell of witches are only the surface of a deeper horror, the psychological mechanisms that allowed ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of cruelty. Fear, power, and prejudice merged to create a society in which difference itself became a crime punishable by death. Listen closely to the wind on an October night. It carries whispers of those who died screaming, their final words consumed by flames that destroyed not just flesh, but the accumulated knowledge of generations. Their ashes fertilize the soil of the modern world, and their spirits linger, reminding us of what happens when fear conquers reason. Historical records document trials, laws, and practices. They do not and cannot prove the supernatural. What they do reveal is chilling enough, a systematic obliteration of wisdom, of those who dared to know too much. Long before the pious marched across Europe with torches, before the screams echoed through Salem, there were women whose knowledge inspired fear in kings and envy in priests. Called wise women, cunning folk, or simply healers, they carried dangerous gifts. In the misty forests of pre-Christian Europe, they gathered herbs beneath the full moon, their fingers stained with the juices of plants that could heal or kill. They whispered to the dying, guiding them into the next world, and ushered babies into a reality that would grow increasingly hostile to their mother's ancient wisdom. Classical texts speak of ritual specialists in sacred groves. Archaeological discoveries from prehistoric and Iron Age Europe reveal tree panning and other ritualized practices, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of the human body and mind. The Roman legions, advancing into Gaul, did not merely conquer territory, they encountered knowledge so potent it terrified them. Tacitus wrote of druids whose curses could allegedly strike soldiers dead from a distance, whether supernatural or psychological. The effect was undeniable. The systematic destruction of these women and their knowledge was not just war, it was cultural erasure. Sacred groves were burned, oral traditions obliterated, and local authority dismantled. The screams of the druids and wise women echoed across the seas, and humanity lost centuries of wisdom. Yet knowledge does not vanish easily. It went underground, passed from mother to daughter in whispered secrets, songs, and stories that appeared harmless to outsiders. These women were not practicing primitive superstition, they were preserving sophisticated understanding of the human body and mind, knowledge that rivaled and often surpassed official medicine. In the frozen forests of the north, where darkness stretched for months, women practiced Sita, rituals so potent that even the fearless Vikings approached them with respect. The Vulvar and Seer traveled from settlement to settlement like omens of fate, wielding trance traditions and spiritual techniques that challenged the patriarchal warrior culture through altered consciousness and prophetic insight. They could communicate with the dead, summoning spirits to answer questions about the future, whether literal or symbolic. Archaeological finds such as the Osberg ship burial reveal the status and reverence of these practitioners. The elaborate burials, staffs, and carved artifacts indicate that their role was not marginal. It was central to society's understanding of life, death, and the unseen forces of the world. The Christianization of Germanic tribes was not just a matter of theology. It was a systematic purge of women whose very existence questioned the authority of the new order. Even as laws pushed female knowledge into the shadows, traces of ritual authority persisted, resurfacing centuries later in the witch trials. Many inquisitorial records describe practices, ritual scarification, psychoactive plants, and simulated death and resurrection that echo suppressed pre-Christian traditions. These were not mere myths. They were remnants of knowledge systems designed to survive, even under relentless persecution. Medieval Europe was a crucible of fear. Plague, famine, war, and disease created a constant demand for healing beyond what the church could provide. Into this void stepped wise women carrying expertise passed down through generations. They understood anatomy from tending battle wounds, pharmacology from preparing herbal remedies, and psychology from counseling the bereaved and traumatized. Yet knowledge is power, and power threatens those who claim a monopoly on truth. The Church, asserting itself as the sole mediator between humanity and the divine, could not tolerate competitors whose methods were demonstrably effective. The solution was both cruel and ingenious: transform healing into witchcraft, wisdom into devilry, compassion into conspiracy. Thomas Aquinas had already drawn distinctions between natural and demonic magic, providing the theological framework to criminalize practices outside scholastic doctrine. Economic motivations reinforced this purge. University-trained physicians, threatened by women who charged less, achieved better results, and enjoyed community trust, demanded legal measures to eliminate competition. Gender played a central role. Men practicing similar techniques were often tolerated or integrated into official structures, while women were executed. These trials reveal not mere superstition, but a calculated intersection of fear, power, and the suppression of female knowledge. Women who possessed knowledge deemed dangerous were accused of witchcraft, facing torture and execution. The message was unmistakable. Knowledge in female hands was a threat that had to be eradicated. In 1487, the world received its most systematic guide to hunting such women, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. This text was far more than a religious treatise. It was a blueprint for persecution, combining theology, law, and social engineering into a deadly instrument designed to eliminate an entire class of people. Written by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, the book was a meticulously crafted manual for identifying, torturing, and executing those whose only crime was their wisdom. Every page dripped with intellectual cruelty, masquerading as scholarly insight, and exposed the terrifying sophistication behind centuries of systematic oppression. The Malleus dismantled every principle of rational justice. Traditional courts demanded evidence, upheld the presumption of innocence, and provided appeal mechanisms. Witchcraft trials inverted all of these safeguards. An accusation alone became proof of guilt. Denial confirmed it. Confessions extracted under torture validated the entire process, and resistance to coercion was framed as proof of a supernatural alliance with the devil. Even the infamous trial by water embodied this perverse logic. If a woman floated, she was guilty, rejected by pure water. If she sank and drowned, she was innocent, but too late for mercy. Every aspect of the legal framework was designed to guarantee conviction, creating a killing machine that fed on its own momentum. The Malleus did more than instruct authorities. It mobilized communities. By framing witchcraft as an existential threat to Christian civilization, ordinary citizens were transformed into holy enforcers. Participation in torture and execution became a divine duty, spreading the contagion of persecution across Europe. The printing press accelerated this process, disseminating the manual like a pathogen and infecting legal systems that had previously maintained relative sanity. Within decades, standardized procedures for identifying and punishing witches spread widely, suggesting a coordinated campaign rather than spontaneous hysteria. The intensity of persecution often reflected political and economic instability. Regions with fragmented governance and weak legal institutions became theaters of devastating witch hunts. The German territories, in particular, suffered severely, with Prince Bishop Johann Georg Fuchs von Dornheim turning Bamberg into a laboratory of human elimination. Courts under his control perfected techniques for extracting confessions, identifying accomplices, and redistributing confiscated property, creating powerful economic incentives for the continuation of persecution. The psychological manipulation embedded in these trials was extraordinary. Accused witches were not only coerced into confessing impossible crimes, they described elaborate rituals, demonic encounters, and fantastical Sabbaths. These confessions were shaped under extreme psychological pressure, revealing how interrogation could twist memory and perception to meet expectations. Across the Atlantic, the same patterns reemerged in Salem, Massachusetts, in the winter of 1692. In this small Puritan village, darkness lasted 16 hours a day, paranoia festered, and fear became contagious. Salem was a laboratory for observing how quickly a community could descend into collective frenzy, devouring its own members through accusation and judicial execution. The witch trials in Salem were not anomalies. They were the logical culmination of centuries of theological and legal frameworks that demanded supernatural explanations for misfortune and abandoned rational evidence in favor of spectral testimony and coerced confessions. The crisis began with children, 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, whose convulsions and strange behaviors, possibly neurological, psychological, or socially induced, were interpreted as signs of demonic possession. The patterns of their behavior were not random. They highlighted those in the community already marginalized: widows, beggars, women who disputed property rights or challenged authority. In Salem, fear and social power intersected, creating an environment where unusual behavior could escalate into life-or-death accusations. The courts, established by Governor William Phipps, abandoned centuries of rational legal procedure. Spectral evidence, testimony that the accused spirit appeared in visions or dreams, was considered absolute proof of guilt. Because it was believed the devil could not take the form of an innocent person without consent, any spectral sighting sealed the accused's fate. Physical alibis became irrelevant, character witnesses meaningless, and appeals to reason futile. Confession became a survival strategy, offering reintegration into the community while maintaining innocence invited execution as a servant of Satan. This systematic psychological pressure incentivized collaboration, turning victims into co-conspirators in their own persecution. The Salem trials stand as a chilling demonstration of how fear, ideology, and social dynamics can override reason, turning ordinary human beings into agents of cruelty against those who are different. The mechanisms behind these events, accusation, hysteria, and coerced confession, are universal, echoing across cultures and centuries, reminding us of humanity's capacity for both fear and complicity. In Salem, maintaining the truth became a matter of life and death, while embracing falsehood offered the only chance for survival. The trials did not seek justice or evidence. They demanded submission to a collective delusion. The execution of Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother revered for her piety and charity, illustrates this horrific dynamic. Even those who knew her character found it impossible to reconcile her death with reality. Yet the trials had gained psychological momentum, and increasingly implausible targets were needed to sustain credibility. With Nurse's execution, the people of Salem began to grasp the true horror of what they had unleashed. No one, regardless of age, virtue, or reputation, was safe. Survival demanded enthusiastic participation in a shared madness, a frenzied devotion to a system that consumed its own. The Salem Witch Trials offer unparalleled insight into how ordinary communities can transform into killing machines. The process followed predictable psychological patterns. Social stress created pressures demanding resolution, and Salem Village was a cauldron of chronic tension. Land disputes, ministerial conflicts, and frontier dangers fueled anxiety that needed an outlet. Witchcraft accusations provided that channel, projecting internal strife onto vulnerable individuals, creating temporary psychological relief through the elimination of scapegoats. Those targeted were often elderly, socially isolated, or economically marginal, ideal vessels for communal hostility. Group polarization magnified suspicions, pushing collective behavior far beyond what individuals might pursue alone. Citizens encouraged one another's fears until paranoia and cruelty reached a fever pitch that no single person could have maintained independently. Authority figures validated these horrors, offering the psychological justification for acts that would normally be morally unthinkable. Ministers, magistrates, and respected community leaders endorsed accusations, and ordinary citizens interpreted this as moral obligation. Dissent was dangerous. Anyone questioning the trials risked being branded a witch themselves. Survival required not just compliance, but active participation, further intensifying the cycle of accusation and execution. Across Europe, the scale and sophistication of persecution reached horrifying extremes. While Salem executed 25 people in a year, German territories engaged in campaigns that destroyed entire villages. The Holy Roman Empire became a laboratory for testing human cruelty, and Prince Bishop Johann Georg Fuchs von Dornheim transformed Bamberg into the epicenter of mass trials. Specialized facilities were constructed for processing accused witches, with torture chambers calibrated to extract confessions and identify accomplices. Psychological methods were as refined as physical ones. Sleep deprivation, stress positions, and subtle coercion broke the will of even the strongest, often leaving no visible injuries while inflicting devastating mental anguish. Economic incentives further fueled the violence. Wealth and property were confiscated from the accused and redistributed to supporters of the persecution campaigns. Targets were selected strategically, with the elimination of clergy, nobility, and merchants designed to consolidate power and enrich allies. The machinery of murder became self-perpetuating. Families of the accused bore the costs of imprisonment, torture, and execution, bankrupting potential resistance while financing the next wave of persecution. Professional witch hunters standardized procedures, creating a terrifyingly efficient system that could be exported to new regions while maximizing economic gain. The psychological engineering in these trials was unparalleled. Confessions extracted under duress created elaborate narratives of Sabbaths, demonic encounters, and conspiracies. Multiple interrogations, isolation, and social pressure created self-perpetuating cycles of accusation. Individuals were compelled to implicate others, producing a chain reaction that could theoretically engulf entire populations. Every new confession validated the system, reinforcing the belief in an omnipresent supernatural threat and justifying further persecution. Mercy toward the accused was framed as complicity with evil, eliminating moral restraint and ensuring that conviction was inevitable regardless of evidence. Persecution was not just religious or social, it was also economic. Property redistribution, elimination of rivals, and professional gain created incentives that intertwined wealth, power, and fear. Healing traditions and independent practitioners were destroyed, consolidating authority and creating dependency on sanctioned medical and spiritual institutions. The system thrived on participation, and ordinary individuals, once morally upright, were transformed into enthusiastic enforcers of cruelty. Religious ideology provided cover, allowing people to maintain a self-image as defenders of civilization while committing systematic atrocities. The decline of witch persecution did not come from sudden enlightenment. It emerged gradually, driven by the realization that the machinery of death had become counterproductive. The systematic elimination of productive members of society began to destabilize communities. Enlightenment thinking offered intellectual frameworks for questioning supernatural claims, but practical concerns were decisive. Accusations began reaching wealthy merchants, government officials, and clergy, revealing that the system endangered those who had once wielded it. Empirical investigation, pioneered by thinkers like Francis Bacon, demonstrated that supernatural phenomena were illusory, products of human imagination, social tension, and psychological manipulation, rather than objective reality. Legal reforms gradually reinstated rational standards of evidence, eliminating spectral testimony and reducing reliance on torture. Physicians provided natural explanations for behaviors once attributed to witchcraft. Mental illness, neurological disorders, and trauma-induced actions replaced superstition with science. The final executions, often decades apart, reflected bureaucratic momentum rather than genuine belief in magic. Anna Goldie's death in Switzerland in 1782 marked the symbolic end of European witch persecution. Her execution was less about fear of supernatural powers than about the lingering machinery of legal and social process, a grim testament to how deeply such systems of fear could embed themselves in human communities. The machinery of persecution proved terrifyingly resilient, continuing to operate long after the justifications that birthed it had faded. In the American colonies, witch prosecutions ended earlier than in Europe, with the Salem trials representing both the apex and the conclusion of legalized terror in North America. Their abrupt cessation demonstrated how persecution could collapse when political will evaporated. Popular beliefs about witchcraft mattered little. The gradual end of trials stemmed from a convergence of factors. The escalating economic costs outweighed any perceived benefit. Legal systems gradually reinstated rational standards of evidence. New religious movements emphasized personal, rather than communal approaches to spiritual struggle, and intellectual developments offered natural explanations for phenomena previously considered supernatural. Yet, even as the fires were extinguished, the psychological scars endured. Families of executed ancestors carried shame and fear for generations, burying their connections beneath layers of silence, while communities traumatized by persecution retained suspicion of difference, a resistance to innovation, and a reluctance to challenge authority that echoed long after the last execution. The systematic destruction of traditional healing knowledge left voids in medical understanding that took centuries to fill. Treatments that had once relieved suffering, practices that had nurtured mental and spiritual health, disappeared during the campaigns of terror, impoverishing healthcare traditions built over countless generations. The removal of feminine spiritual authority, wise women, healers, and visionaries further entrenched male-dominated religious hierarchies, excluding women from leadership and devaluing knowledge tied to female experience and wisdom. Yet, alongside this cultural devastation, the period left a paradoxical intellectual legacy. Rational inquiry and evidence-based reasoning gained ground. Legal procedures strengthened, and society learned to question superstition. But at the same time, skepticism hardened against alternative healing traditions and non-rational approaches to understanding human experience. By the 19th century, the witch had undergone a remarkable transformation. From a figure of terror, she became a symbol of romantic rebellion against industrial modernity and rigid religious orthodoxy. Literature, art, and folklore rehabilitated her image, presenting witches as tragic victims of intolerance, misunderstood yet powerful figures. Gothic novels reframed witchcraft in psychological and aesthetic terms, turning supernatural elements into symbols of human conflict, societal critique, and personal rebellion. Folklore collectors and academics preserved stories that had survived centuries of persecution, transforming witchcraft from a theological problem into a subject of rational cultural inquiry. Instead of asking whether witches were real, scholars explored the social, political, and psychological forces that produced mass hysteria, creating a space for historical reflection and cultural preservation. The second-wave feminist movement of the 1960s and 1970s deepened this reinterpretation, presenting the witch as a symbol of feminine power resisting patriarchal oppression. Scholars argued that the persecution of witches represented a deliberate attempt to erase goddess worship and feminine spiritual authority, replacing collaborative, woman-centered practices with hierarchical, male-dominated institutions. The witch became an emblem of resistance, a figure whose defiance and knowledge had been feared and suppressed, and whose legacy could now inspire contemporary struggles for gender equality. Feminist spirituality movements adopted witch imagery as a celebration of women's connection to nature, healing, and autonomous spiritual authority. Though historical continuity remained largely symbolic, the modern witch embodied empowerment, creativity, and reclamation of tradition. Today, witchcraft and witch imagery have fully entered global popular culture. Films, television, literature, and digital platforms have transformed witches into objects of fascination and entertainment, rather than objects of fear. Social media connects enthusiasts worldwide, allowing traditions and stories to spread in new forms, while commercialized depictions like Halloween costumes and decorations often detach the witch from spiritual or historical context. Modern neo-pagan movements, however, engage deeply with reconstructed magical practices, blending historical research with contemporary spirituality. Though speculative, these practices honor the past while creating living traditions rooted in both scholarship and personal experience. As October shadows lengthen and the veil between worlds thins, the story of the witch becomes a mirror. The trials of Salem, Bamberg, and Würzburg were not anomalies, they were revelations. They show how ordinary people, under fear, authority, and social pressure, can commit extraordinary evil while believing themselves righteous. The real terror is not supernatural, it is the human capacity for self-deception. Every executioner, torturer, and accuser believed they served justice. Every innocent life destroyed was justified in the minds of its perpetrators. The witches died, but they never truly disappeared. They live on in every person told they are too much, too powerful, too independent. They whisper in every act of silencing knowledge, every punishment of difference, every moment fear conquers reason. The lessons of the witch trials endure. Identify the vulnerable, dehumanize them, construct legal frameworks to remove protection, mobilize the community with fear and economic incentive, and watch ordinary people transform into instruments of destruction. Civilization is fragile. Moral progress is provisional. The witch trials remind us that the capacity for extraordinary cruelty exists within all of us, waiting for the right conditions to awaken. History shows not only the horrors humans inflict on each other, but also the resilience of those who resist, adapt, and rise from ashes of fear. The same psychological forces that once drove the citizens of Salem to hang their neighbors still exist in every human community, lying in wait for the right mix of stress, leadership, and opportunity to reemerge. The winds of October carry their warnings across the centuries. Remember your own capacity, how quickly the familiar can become strange, the neighbor an enemy, the different dangerous. Within every human heart lies both wisdom and darkness. The witch trials didn't end because people recognized their evil. They ended because the persecution became too costly to sustain. This reality is far more terrifying than any ghost story. Every generation faces the same choice. Will we learn from history or repeat it with new victims and fresh justifications? Will we see the witch hunter within ourselves or wait until we hold torches and demand someone burn? The fires are always ready to ignite. The only protection is vigilance against the darkness within. The witch trials may have ended, but their echoes live on in every heart that chooses fear over understanding, conformity over compassion, and destruction over healing. The lessons remain. History's shadows are long, and the questions they raise about ourselves are eternal. So reflect on these truths, stay aware of the darkness we all carry, and if you want to continue exploring the depths of human psychology and history's most disturbing lessons, make sure to subscribe and join us on this journey.